Right now, in the exact stretch of ocean between Africa and the Caribbean, where the majority of the Atlantic's most dangerous hurricanes are born, a tropical wave is trying to organize into the season's next named storm. The National Hurricane Center has designated it Invest 92L, giving it a 70% chance of developing within the next 7 days, with forecasters saying a full tropical depression could form as early as this weekend. On its own, that's a fairly routine piece of hurricane season news. Here's what isn't routine. As of this week, the Atlantic has produced only 2 named storms all season, Arthur and Bertha, with a third Cristobal just barely forming after nearly a full month of complete silence in the basin. That's genuinely shocking when you compare it to where the season normally stands by this point. Last year, 5 named storms had already formed by this same date, and it's happening at the exact moment meteorologists say the Atlantic hurricane season should be ramping up toward its climatological peak. Meanwhile, on the complete opposite side of the country, the Pacific is doing something almost the reverse, actively producing storm after storm, with one system carrying a 90% chance of development and Hawaii sitting directly in its projected path. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's trying to develop right now, why the season has been so strangely, dramatically quiet in one ocean while genuinely active in another, and what's actually driving this split. No exaggeration, just what the National Hurricane Center and NOAA's own forecasters are saying in real time. If you want to keep following these systems as they develop, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this situation is changing day by day across multiple basins simultaneously. A thumbs up helps this critical information reach more people who need it. Let's get into it. Let's start with what's actually trying to form right now, because there are genuinely several systems worth tracking simultaneously across 2 different oceans. In the Atlantic, the National Hurricane Center designated the primary disturbance in the basin as Invest 92L this week, specifically flagging a 70% chance of development within the next 7 days, with forecasters noting a real possibility that a tropical depression could form as early as this coming weekend. This disturbance sits within what meteorologists call the main development region, the stretch of the Atlantic Ocean between the west coast of Africa and the Caribbean Sea, where the majority of the basin's most powerful long-track hurricanes historically originate. According to Fox Weather, numerous additional tropical waves, disturbances capable of producing showers and thunderstorms as they move westward, were also emerging off the coast of Africa into that same main development region this week, potentially fueling the Atlantic's next named storm, even beyond Invest 92L specifically. That disturbance arrived alongside genuinely significant news for the Atlantic season overall. According to the Weather Network, forecasters at the National Hurricane Center were, as of this week, actively monitoring the development of Tropical Storm Cristobal, a system that finally formed after nearly a full month had passed since the Atlantic's last named storm. Think about that specific detail for a moment, because it's genuinely the core of why the season has felt so different from a typical year. An entire month passed in the middle of what's supposed to be the buildup toward hurricane season's peak without the Atlantic producing a single new named storm. Newsweek's coverage from this same week laid out the broader picture with real clarity. As of early August, only 2 named storms, Arthur and Bertha, had formed in the Atlantic basin, a total sitting below what's typically expected as the season approaches its climatological peak, which historically runs from mid-August through mid-October. The National Hurricane Center was tracking 2 separate disturbances in the Atlantic and 2 more in the Pacific during that same window, including one system southeast of Hawaii that, at the time, carried the highest odds of development among everything being monitored. And in a separate piece of coverage, just days later, Newsweek reported the National Hurricane Center was watching 5 distinct areas of potential tropical development spread across both the Atlantic and Pacific basins simultaneously, describing this as a genuine uptick in activity following what had been, up to that point, an unusually quiet stretch across the Atlantic specifically. Here's the number that really puts this season's slow start in perspective. According to Newsweek's reporting, by this same point last year, 5 named storms had already formed in the Atlantic. This year, heading into the same week, the count sits at just 2 confirmed storms with a third, Cristobal, only just organizing. That's not a minor statistical footnote. It represents a genuinely significant measurable gap between how this season has unfolded and how a typical recent Atlantic hurricane season behaves by the exact same point on the calendar. So, what's actually driving this unusually quiet stretch? The answer comes down almost entirely to a single powerful climate phenomenon that meteorologists have been tracking closely all year, and it connects directly to stories we've covered on this channel before. According to ABC 13 Houston's tropical weather coverage, NOAA released its August update to the 2026 Atlantic Hurricane Outlook this week, and the agency actually reduced both the total number of named storms and the number of major hurricanes it expects for the remainder of the season, each by 1 storm compared to its earlier projections. The primary driver behind that downward revision, according to Chief Meteorologist Travis Herzog's coverage, is a rapidly strengthening El Niño pattern currently developing in the Pacific Ocean, a pattern that tends to generate high wind shear over the Atlantic basin, and wind shear is genuinely one of the most effective natural mechanisms for suppressing tropical cyclone development. It's worth taking a moment to actually explain why wind shear does this, because it's the entire mechanical reason behind this season's quiet Atlantic stretch. A tropical storm or hurricane needs a very specific, stable internal structure to form and intensify, essentially a tall, vertically stacked column of thunderstorm activity, all rotating together around a shared center. Wind shear refers to a change in wind speed or direction at different altitudes in the atmosphere. When strong wind shear is present, the winds higher up in the atmosphere are blowing in a different direction, or at a different speed, than the winds closer to the surface. That mismatch physically tilts and disrupts a developing storm's structure, tearing apart the organized column of thunderstorms a tropical system needs to intensify, essentially decapitating a storm before it ever gets the chance to fully organize. El Niño years reliably produce exactly this kind of elevated wind shear across the Atlantic, which is precisely why strong El Niño patterns have such a well-documented, consistent history of suppressing Atlantic hurricane activity even during years when ocean water temperatures themselves might otherwise be warm enough to support more storms. CNN's coverage from this same week reinforced just how seriously forecasters are now taking this El Niño-driven suppression. According to CNN, multiple independent forecasting groups, including NOAA and Colorado State University's widely respected hurricane research team, have grown increasingly confident in their forecasts for a genuinely muted season overall. NOAA's own updated forecast, released just the week before, raised the probability of a below-average season from 55% all the way up to 75%, a substantial jump in confidence. Perhaps even more striking, that same updated NOAA forecast dropped its projected range for major hurricanes, meaning storms reaching Category 3 or stronger, from a previous range of 1 to 3 storms down to a new range of 0 to 2. CNN was direct about what that specific revision could mean historically, noting that if the 2026 season ends without producing a single major hurricane, it would be the first time that's happened since 2013, a genuinely significant historical marker for anyone who follows Atlantic hurricane patterns closely. Fox Weather's coverage added one more useful data point to this picture, confirming that NOAA's most recently updated 2026 Atlantic hurricane outlook now estimates 7 to 13 named storms will form across the entire season, with 2 to 6 of those expected to become hurricanes, and up to 2 potentially reaching at Category 3 strength or higher. Compare that range against the confirmed count so far, just 2 storms fully formed with a third. Cristobal, only just organizing as of this week, and you can see genuinely how far behind pace this season has fallen relative to even NOAA's own already reduced expectations. Now here's where this story becomes genuinely more nuanced and interesting than simply the Atlantic is quiet this year, because the exact same El Niño pattern suppressing storm formation in one ocean basin is simultaneously supercharging activity in another. While the Atlantic has struggled to produce even its third named storm of the season, the Pacific has been doing almost the opposite. According to ABC 13's coverage, Tropical Storm Amanda was actively swirling in the middle of the eastern Pacific this week, though it posed no direct threat to land given its position. While separately, Tropical Storm Christina continued swirling off the coast of El Salvador, with moisture from that system expected to move into the Gulf of Mexico over the weekend, potentially interacting with weather patterns much closer to the U.S. mainland even without Christina itself making any kind of direct landfall. The Weather Network's coverage highlighted the specific Pacific system generating the most genuine concern this week, a disturbance carrying a striking 90% chance of developing into a full tropical system, with Hawaii sitting directly in its projected path. That's a genuinely significant probability for meteorologists to be sighting this far out, and it reflects real high confidence that this specific system is going to organize and continue tracking toward the islands. This is precisely the kind of split basin pattern that meteorologists specifically associate with strong El Niño years, and it comes down to the same basic physics driving the Atlantic's suppression, just playing out in reverse. El Niño is defined by unusually warm ocean water spreading across the central and eastern tropical Pacific. That warmer water provides considerably more fuel for tropical cyclone development directly within and near that specific stretch of ocean, even as the broader atmospheric changes triggered by that same warming pattern generate the wind shear that suppresses activity thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. In other words, El Niño doesn't simply make for a quiet or active hurricane season globally, it reliably redistributes where tropical activity concentrates, generally favoring increased activity across the Pacific while actively working against storm formation in the Atlantic, exactly the pattern this week's forecast discussions are describing in real time. It's worth zooming out to the broader global tropical cyclone picture for 2026 to understand just how significant this redistribution has actually been this year. According to tracking data compiled across all of the world's tropical cyclone basins, 2026 has so far produced 43 total tropical systems worldwide, with 23 of those reaching named storm status and a combined death toll of 142 people, along with more than $3.5 billion in total damage. The single strongest storm of the entire year across every basin worldwide has been Typhoon Sinlaku, which reached a minimum central pressure of 905 millibars and maximum sustained winds of 215 kilometers per hour, roughly 130 miles per hour, when it struck as the 2026 Pacific typhoon season's first super typhoon back in April. That's genuinely significant context because it confirms that 2026 has not been a globally quiet year for tropical cyclones overall. It's been a year where activity has concentrated heavily in specific basins, the Pacific typhoon season specifically getting off to its earliest start since 2019, while the Atlantic has fallen dramatically behind its typical seasonal pace, exactly the kind of basin-by-basin redistribution a strengthening El Niño reliably produces. Let's bring this back to the systems actually trying to develop right now, because understanding the broader El Niño context helps explain exactly why forecasters are treating even a fairly routine-sounding 70% development chance for Invest 92L as genuinely newsworthy this week. In a normal, more typical Atlantic hurricane season, a tropical wave carrying a 70% chance of developing into a depression within the main development region during the second week of August would be treated as fairly unremarkable expected activity for this specific point on the calendar. This year, given how dramatically the season has lagged behind its typical pace, that same disturbance becomes a genuinely significant story, potentially representing the season's third and fourth named storms forming in relatively close succession after nearly a full month of complete Atlantic silence. It's also genuinely worth understanding what happens to a system even once it does successfully develop into a named storm during a year with conditions this hostile. Tropical Storm Christina, swirling off the coast of El Salvador in the eastern Pacific, and Tropical Storm Amanda, positioned further out in the open eastern Pacific, both illustrate a pattern that's become fairly common this year. Storms that do manage to form, but that struggle to intensify significantly, or that remain confined to open ocean without threatening major landfall, given the broader atmospheric conditions working against sustained strengthening in several of these systems. Newsweek's coverage specifically noted that because the projected track for at least one of this week's monitored Atlantic systems keeps it over open ocean, there are currently no coastal watches. Warnings, or anticipated land impacts associated with that particular disturbance, a genuinely reassuring detail for coastal residents, even as forecasters continue watching the broader pattern closely. There's also a specific, more localized piece of this week's tropical outlook worth understanding for anyone along the Gulf Coast specifically. According to ABC 13's coverage, meteorologists were closely monitoring the Bay of Campeche over the following few days, watching for a broad area of low pressure that could potentially form in that specific region, though development odds there were assessed as genuinely low, around just 10%. Even without that system becoming an officially designated tropical system, forecasters noted it could still work in combination with an approaching cold front to spread widespread moisture into the Gulf Coast region by the weekend and into the following week. A useful reminder that not every consequential piece of tropical weather forecasting actually requires an officially named storm to produce meaningful rainfall impacts for coastal communities. So, stepping back from the individual systems and looking at the complete picture this week, what's the honest, accurate summary of where the 2026 hurricane season actually stands? The Atlantic has been running dramatically behind its typical pace, with only 2 confirmed named storms and a third, Cristobal, just barely organizing after a nearly month-long stretch of complete silence in the basin. A slowdown OAA's own forecasters directly attribute to a rapidly strengthening El Niño generating unusually high wind shear across the Atlantic. That same El Niño pattern is simultaneously driving genuinely elevated activity across the Pacific, with multiple systems actively swirling, including one carrying a striking 90% development probability with Hawaii sitting directly in its projected path. And even within this unusually quiet Atlantic stretch, a genuine, actively monitored disturbance, Invest 92L, is trying to develop right now within the main development region, carrying a 70% chance of organizing into the season's next depression within the coming week. It's worth being genuinely careful and precise about what quiet actually means in this context, because it's a distinction that matters enormously for anyone living along a coastline that could still be affected. A below-average or even historically quiet Atlantic hurricane season, by NOAA's own updated numbers, still means somewhere between 7 and 13 total named storms are expected to form before the season concludes, and between 0 and 2 of those storms could still reach major hurricane strength. A quiet season is not the same thing as a season with zero risk. It simply means the overall frequency and intensity of storms is expected to run below the long-term historical average. A genuinely important distinction that coastal emergency planners and residents alike need to keep in mind even during a year when the headlines are dominated by stories about how unusually slow the season has been so far. CNN's coverage was direct about the specific historical stakes riding on how the remainder of the season actually unfolds. If 2026 concludes without producing a single major hurricane, it would mark the first time that's happened since 2013, a genuinely notable historical marker given how consistently the Atlantic has produced at least one Category 3 or stronger storm in nearly every intervening year since then. Whether this year actually joins 2013 in that specific historical category remains genuinely uncertain, and it will likely depend heavily on exactly how this current El Niño pattern continues evolving through the traditional peak of the season, which historically runs from mid-August all the way through mid-October, meaning the vast majority of this season's most consequential activity, if any develops at all, still genuinely lies ahead rather than behind us. For anyone along the U.S. Gulf Coast or Atlantic seaboard, the practical guidance heading into this genuinely uncertain stretch of the season remains exactly what emergency management officials consistently emphasize every single year, regardless of how quiet or active a season's early months have actually been. A below-average forecast, even one revised downward multiple times by NOAA itself, is never a guarantee that no storm will ultimately threaten a specific coastline this year. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and Hurricane Michael in 2018 both occurred during seasons that were broadly forecast to run below or near average overall, a genuinely important historical reminder that even a single storm forming at exactly the wrong location and the wrong time can produce a genuinely catastrophic consequential landfall, regardless of how the rest of that particular season's statistics ultimately shake out. Maintaining a hurricane preparedness plan, knowing your specific evacuation zone if you live along the coast, and continuing to monitor updates directly from the National Hurricane Center throughout the remainder of this season, right through the traditional peak window in September and October, remains genuinely sound guidance independent of exactly how sluggish this particular Atlantic season's opening months have actually been. And for anyone in Hawaii specifically, given the genuinely elevated 90% development probability currently being tracked in the Pacific with the islands sitting directly in that system's projected path. This is a moment worth paying particularly close attention to updates directly from the Central Pacific Hurricane Center in the coming days, since a system carrying that kind of confidence in eventual development represents a genuinely credible, actively evolving threat regardless of how quiet the news cycle surrounding the Atlantic has otherwise been this week. This is a genuinely live, still developing situation across multiple ocean basins simultaneously, not a story with any single, clean resolution to report. Invest 92L remains an active area to watch in the Atlantic's main development region. Tropical Storm Cristobal continues organizing after finally breaking the Atlantic's nearly month-long silent stretch. And in the Pacific, the system carrying a 90% chance of development continues tracking toward Hawaii, even as tropical storms Christina and Amanda continue swirling elsewhere across that same considerably more active basin. We'll keep tracking every one of these systems closely as they continue to develop across both the Atlantic and Pacific in the days ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss those updates, and if you're along the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, or anywhere across the Hawaiian Islands right now, please continue following official guidance directly from the National Hurricane Center and the Central Pacific Hurricane Center, rather than relying on secondhand reports. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.